What happens when we die? Is there a God? Is my wife sleeping with her boss when she says she's staying late at work? Or is she just staying late at work and sleeping with her boss there? These are some of the most important questions we face as human beings, and I'm here to answer another one. One of the utmost importance. Everyone is thinking it, but most are too afraid to ask. What would Hall of Fame Broncos quarterback John Elway's passing numbers look like in the modern NFL? I'm going to answer that today with math.
So get off your ass, let's do some math.
And I'm gonna warn you, math sucks. But let's take a look. We're going balls deep into John Elway's numbers. Hey, today's episode is sponsored by my friends from Underdog Fantasy. Why would you do a fantasy draft in July? Well, Underdog is different in that once you draft your team, you are 100% done managing it. They tally your best scores via your best lineup every week throughout the season. You do nothing after drafting your team. You can play in 3, 5, 10, 15, 25, and $100 leagues ranging from 3 to 12 person drafts. Or you can aim for the ultimate $2 million prize in the Best Ball Mania tournament. Now, I've hosted a bunch of private drafts, so shout out to everyone who's playing against me in those. I'll keep dropping links for those drafts on Twitter. But also, this is a great tool to prepare you for your yearly fantasy leagues. Underdog has one of the most accurate ADPs for players, and since each game has a little money on the line, if you want to do a bunch of, say, $3 or $5 drafts, essentially as your mock drafts, you will get a much more accurate idea of where players are going in the draft, since people aren't bouncing after like 2 rounds, which you see in a bunch of the mock draft simulators. Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100 when you sign up with my code THATSGOOD. My link is in the description. Use my code THATSGOOD at Underdog Fantasy and enter the Best Ball Mania 3 tournament today. Why am I a robot? Ugh. Now, to attempt to answer this girthy question about John Elway, I'm going to explain my methodology for how I'm going to adjust passing numbers from the 80s and 90s to fit the numbers you might see in today's NFL, where the passing game and their numbers have been inflated, much like our sweet American dollars. And of course, the opposite of any football old tiny hands Tom Brady has ever thrown. So I'll start off by saying that on a season per season basis, John Elway did not put up godly numbers. The Duke never had more than 27 touchdown passes in a season, only once hit 4,000 passing yards, and had double-digit interceptions every year. But he was consistently in the top of the league. The nerds who never watched him play like to ding him for what they perceive as pedestrian numbers. But the nerds who come after them in like 30 years will ask why? Why is Kirk Cousins not in the Hall of Fame? Just because they both lined up under a guard once doesn't make them the same caliber player. John Elway, when he retired in 1998, was second all-time in passing yards, trailing only Dan Marino. He is 11th now, and everyone with more passing yards not named Marino played after Elway. Brady, Breeze, Manning, Rivers, Eli Manning, Matt Ryan. That should tell you how much the NFL passing game has changed starting in the late 90s. Same goes for passing touchdowns. Elway is now 13th all time, but when he retired, he was 3rd, trailing only Marino and Fran Tarkenton. And Russell Wilson, new Broncos quarterback, is already 15th all time in passing TDs. Also, John Elway didn't give a fuck about his stats. He wanted to win, and he did it 64% of the time he stepped onto the field. 148 wins when he retired, which was most all time at the time. And the win rate of 64% was 3rd best all time for QBs with over 100 wins, trailing only Joe Montana and Terry Bradshaw. 2 guys who played for Hall of Fame head coaches in Chuck Noll and Bill Walsh, and dominant teams, dynasties, if you will, for their era. So let's take a look at Elway's averages over his career, and we'll break it up into two parts, the 80s and the 90s. In the 80s, John Elway averaged 17 touchdowns per season, 3,027 yards, and 16 interceptions. That was with head coach Dan Reeves, who basically tried to punish Elway every time he stepped on the field. He was the OG Pat Shurmur when it came to run, pass. Elway just managed to bail out the offense over and over again.
I'd like to start out this press conference with a thank you to John Elway.
And then eventually got to destroy Dan Reeves in Super Bowl 33. In the 90s, Elway got a little safer with the football and spent more time in the pocket. Notably, this is when the Broncos offense finally got some elite talent in Shannon Sharpe, Terrell Davis, Rod Smith, and Ed McCaffrey, who became huge factors in that offense. Elway put up 20 touchdowns in the 90s per season, 3,364 passing yards, and 12 picks per year. Like I said, Denver got some playmakers, but the most important part of the 90s equation was getting head coach Mike Shanahan as the play caller. Think about Matthew Stafford finally getting Sean McVay as his play caller. Each guy had to wait about 12 years to finally be paired with the right head coach. The difference being Elway somehow managed 3 Super Bowl appearances before getting his McVay, who again learned under the Shanahan coaching tree. Now I mentioned Matthew Stafford, but Elway's 2 best modern QB comps are probably Josh Allen and or Patrick Mahomes. And I know Chiefs fans love to hate to admit that. Now Mahomes is easy to see in terms of being able to throw a football from any angle, which I believe their shared baseball background is responsible for. But Josh Allen is a clone of John Elway in terms of arm strength, size, and ability to make plays with his legs. Now John Elway attempted on average 31 passes per game versus Mahomes, who's at 38 passes per game. Elway, like Josh Allen, had a hero tendency, believing he could make throws not even God himself could complete, which, resulted in too many picks early in his career. Now Josh Allen was attempting about 32 passes per game in his first couple seasons, which is closer to Elway through his career, but Allen is one of the best rushing QBs in the NFL, which Elway kind of was in his time, and as Allen has progressed, his passing attempts per game jumped up to 38 in 2021. Also consider Patrick Mahomes is averaging 301 passing yards per game. That's currently number 1 all time. Jared Goff's 258 passing yards per game, which isn't much right now, is better than John Elway's 220 was. But again, when John Elway retired, he was 6th all time in that category, and in no scenario would anyone ever take Jared Goff over John Elway. The entire point of this video is to shut up the idiots who don't understand how the game has progressed. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 3 of Elway's seasons, 86, 93, and 97. Why those years? Well, because he had a different head coach in all 3 of those seasons, and he played in all 16 games of those years, which makes the math simpler. That last part is important for a dumbass like myself. Then I'm going to take 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021 scaled down to 16 games and find the average passing numbers from those seasons to create a baseline for what modern passing numbers look like. We're going to find the total touchdowns, yards, and interceptions from those seasons to give us the new Elway numbers. In 2018, there were 121,737 passing yards, 847 touchdown passes, and 419 interceptions across the league. This was the year Mahomes threw for 50 of those tutties. In 2019, there were 120,301 passing yards, 797 touchdown passes, and 420 interceptions. Naturally, Jameis Winston, as you know, was responsible for 33 of those touchdowns and 30 of those picks. 2020, 122,957 passing yards, 871 touchdowns, and 395 picks. Those are impressive league-wide numbers, especially when you consider Kendall Hinton and Ben DiNucci started games that year. 2021, after you scale it down from 17 to 16 games, you get 116,897 passing yards, 790 touchdowns, and 414 picks. Take the average of those 4 years, and you end up with about 120,473 passing yards, 826 touchdown passes, and 412 interceptions per season across the league. And now we shall count up the 3 Elway years I am cherry picking from. In 1986, there were 101,128 passing yards, so much lower, 586 touchdown passes, lower, and 581 interceptions, higher. So Jesus, what a bad year to be a quarterback. Do you see what I see here? 160 more interceptions across the league in 1986 compared to the last couple years, and about 280 fewer touchdown passes. That's why when you look back at great QB stats, they don't hold up unless we're talking about Dan Marino, who is the greatest passer of all time. In 1993, there were 96,490 passing yards, 517 touchdown passes, and 469 interceptions. Holy shit, that was still a bad year to be a quarterback. In 1997, there were 105,288 passing yards, 617 touchdown passes, and 479 interceptions. When you take the average of those 3 seasons and factor in expansion from 28 to 32 teams, you have 103,760 pass yards, 640 touchdowns, and 570 interceptions. An important thing to note here is that the NFL average for passing numbers in the 80s and 90s was about 17,000 fewer passing yards per season, and there were almost 200 fewer passing TDs per season. Look, throwing in the 80s and 90s for the math was not easy. It was like playing Madden on All Madden while being drunk, versus today, which is like playing Madden on All Pro on Adderall to help you focus. More seriously, it was more difficult to throw the ball down the field in the 80s and the 90s because defensive backs were able to, get away with assault, both before and after the ball got there. Roughing the passer was around during John Elway's era, but was only flagged when a quarterback needed an organ transplant.
Oh wow, is that a pancreas?
Plus, there are more dome stadiums now than there were back then, which adds to the inflation in ways that I don't feel like quantifying, but I'm sure someone else has somewhere. Finally, I think wide receivers are more specialized and schemes have gotten far better following the popularization of the West Coast offense starting in the 80s and spreading more widely in the 90s. In the 80s, the only way you were leading the league in passing yards was if your name was Dan. Again, Marino is an outlier. 39 to 4,500 passing yards was very high versus today where 48 to 5,400 is very high.
It was no fucking flub. It was not a flub.
And if you are perusing John Elway's interceptions and sacks, you might think, oh God, he was terrible. But on adjusted passing stats, he was above average in both of those categories almost every year he was in the NFL. Okay, 86, 93, 97, 3 of Elway's Pro Bowl seasons, and he had a lot. In 1986, the year Elway went to his first Super Bowl, he had 3,485 passing yards, 19 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. Looks pretty good compared to the shit show elsewhere in the NFL, doesn't it? The leader in passing that year was Dan Marino with over 4,700 passing yards, 44 touchdowns, and 23 interceptions. But Marino was the anomaly, considering Ken O'Brien was second in touchdown passes with just 25 that year. So when you do some dividing, and I'm factoring in 28 teams instead of 32, that took some fucking algebra. Elway had 3.3% of the league's total passing yards, 2.8% of the total touchdown passes, and 1.9% of the interceptions in 86. 93, Elway went 9-7 under Wade Phillips, but had pretty good passing numbers, 4,030 passing yards, 25 TDs, and just 10 picks. You can make a strong case Elway was the best QB that year statistically. Steve Young was the only player with more touchdowns, but also had 16 interceptions and fewer yards. Jim Kelly and Troy Aikman both made the Super Bowl that season. Kelly had 18 touchdowns and 18 picks, while Aikman had a dominant 15 touchdowns. Put Elway on either of those teams and it's a bloodbath. But for that season, for Elway, that's 3.9% of the total passing yards, 4.2% of the TDs, and just 1.8% of the total picks in the NFL in 93. 1997, the year Elway finally breaks through and wins his first Super Bowl. 3,635 passing yards, 27 tugs, and 11 picks. That's his career high in touchdown passes, and believe it or not, the most touchdown passes in a season for any Broncos QB not named Peyton Manning. In 1997, you really started to see the passing game open up with Brett Favre airing it out for 35 TDs. Even Jeff fucking George had a random 29 touchdown year. But Elway was fourth in touchdowns even at 36 years old. When you do the math, that's 3.5% of the total yards, 4.1% of the touchdowns, and 2.2% of the picks in 97. So when we averaged those 3 selected seasons for Elway, he had about 3,717 passing yards, 24 touchdowns, and 11 picks. Compared to the average total numbers in those 3 seasons, Elway had 3.6% of the total league passing yards, 3.8% of the TDs, and 1.9% of the picks. Here's where we find out, finally, how Elway's numbers averaged out would translate to the modern NFL. So 3.6% of the passing yards in the modern NFL would equal, for John Elway, 4,337 passing yards. 3.8% of the touchdowns in the modern NFL looks like about 31 touchdown passes, and 1.9% of the interceptions would be about 8 interceptions. But wait, I didn't even mention John Elway's rushing stats. When he retired, he was 4th all-time in quarterback rushing yards behind Randall Cunningham, who is currently active, Steve Young, who was also active, and Fran Tarkenton. You have to keep in mind how dumb the NFL was back then. Running as a QB was seen as a gimmick, and no team wanted to commit to that as a possible tool to help the offense. Elway is still currently 10th all-time in quarterback rushing yards, 9th in rushing TDs. So on average, Elway finished with about the 4th most rushing yards per season and about the 5th most rushing TDs, and led the league with 6 rushing TDs in 91. So in 2021, Elway would have been on par with guys like Kyler Murray and his 423 rushing yards, Cam Newton or Russell Wilson in 2020, and Deshaun Watson in 2019. I just wanted to mention that so you had an idea where Elway might stack up in terms of how he would be used in the rushing game. But let's look purely at the passing stats now, because that's what's changed the most since Elway retired. And we'll compare the Duke to the quarterbacks of the last 4 years. So for 2021, Elway would have finished tied for 9th place with about 33 touchdown passes. That's when you adjust for the extra game, 7th in passing yards and 17th in interceptions. We're basically looking at Joe Burrow's 2021 season with a couple fewer picks. 2020, Elway would have been tied for 10th in passing touchdowns, 6th in yards, and had the 10th most interceptions. Elway's projected stats are almost identical to Justin Herbert's Rookie of the Year season in 2020, the greatest rookie QB year of all time. Elway would have had just 1 more passing yard than Herbert, 1 more pick, and the same number of touchdowns, but probably double the wins. Herbert did have the benefit of playing more than half of his games in a dome, of course. 2019, John Elway would have been 3rd in touchdown passes, 6th in yards, and tied for 14th in interceptions. His closest comp that year was Dak Prescott or Russell Wilson. 2018, Elway would have been 9th in TDs, 8th in yards, and 15th in picks. Almost identical to Phillip Rivers, who was a Pro Bowler that year for the Chargers. However you slice it, Elway would have been a top 10 quarterback statistically in the modern NFL, where there are currently a shit ton of great quarterbacks. And I'm not really even factoring in that Elway probably would have played better in the modern NFL. And combine Elway's stats with his late game heroics, his clutch gene, and he'd be deadly. Oh, and did I mention John Elway played his entire career without an ACL and won both of his Super Bowls with a torn biceps muscle and invented the fucking scooter?
Johnny John
Thanks for watching Balls Deep here on That's Good Sports. If you want more deep dives into the NFL, check out my Balls Deep NFL Deep Dives playlist. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, @Brandon Perna if you want to follow me in those places.